I played through a lot of LucasArts games. Well, not a lot of them when I was younger. One that I got a little fascinated with when I first saw it came out was Loom. Now, you have to know that years ago, there were certain magazines that would review such games, and not only that, but name one as their game of the month and almost give you a complete playthrough of the game in there. And of course, this was at the time when an actual computer game could be completed in one sitting, actually needed to be completed in one sitting. But Loom is probably one of the most beautiful games and has one of the more beautiful soundtracks, and that's part of what its appeal is. Now, if you have never played Loom, it was one of the monumental games released by LucasArts. Sadly, it didn't get past its first game. Apparently, there were, and this is something I learned years later, there were supposed to be two more games. And you were introduced to the characters who would be the protagonists in those two games in Loom. Because the story of Loom sort of leaves off with an ending that makes you wonder what happened. But I'm digressing there. You see, was, as I said, it was one of the greats of LucasArts. My first time playing it was actually years after it was released when I picked up a 5 set of LucasArts games. Now, this was before CDs and all that, or CD gaming. This was before CD gaming wiped out the floppy disk games. And I had picked up the LucasArts Classics, in which they had Maniac Mansion, Zack McCracken and the Alien Mindbenders, Indiana Jones, The Last Crusade, the adventure game, Secret of Monkey Island 1, and Loom. And Loom had always caught my appeal because in my youth I learned how to play piano and I know how to read sheet music. So, it's the music appeal was there. And one theme that runs in the game is swans as the representation of transcendence. So I picked up on that, and they use the music of Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake. And that is very beautiful music to choose. And if you pay attention if you play Loom, you will hear various parts of Swan Lake, almost recognizable parts. And it has actually beautiful artwork, and it was one of those games in which, probably even one of their first ones, I could be wrong on this, where it was almost, you couldn't kill the character. You were given unlimited chances to figure out what you needed to do, when you needed to do it. And it took some thinking, some simple thinking, sometimes a little harder. Because everything revolved around 4-note chords or drafts. They called them drafts in the game. And according to the lore, these drafts were woven into everything. There was a draft for asleep or sleep. There was a draft for being awake. There was a draft for healing. There was a draft for twisting and untwisting. And that was another thing. Certain drafts you could not play backwards, or you could only play them forward. Some were just palindromes. Like, you learn the draft to open, to close, you just reverse it. If you pay attention to, and you have to solve puzzles and learn drafts in such a way, you want to learn a draft to sharpen, you have to see someone sharpening something, but you also must get close enough to them. And some drafts you only learn by actually, quote, looking ahead. Now, there was some mysticism in the game, and it is remarkable how well this game was made. And it's sad that it never got a proper sequel in the lifetime of the games. But it could be that they went with a more profitable title. And if you pay attention, you will see, they'll throw little nods to other games in some of their LucasArts games. In fact, if you play Monkey Island, you'll see the one bad guy from Loom in it. He's actually hawking Loom. But Loom is actually an experience. It is recommended that when earlier releases of the game, if you had three modes you could play on. You could play on practice, you could play on normal, and you could play on expert. And the difference was, if you played on practice, you saw the drafts that you had to play. You were given every bit of information, and even you had on your distaff the scale from C to high C. If you played on normal, you were shown the notes. You didn't get shown the letters of the notes, so you had to really pay attention to pitch or what parts of the distaff glowed. And if you played expert, you really had to have a good ear for pitch or a good understanding of it. Now, Loom also reveals its backstory in bits and pieces as you play the game. A warning of things to come. Now, as you play the game as Bobbin Threadbare, the Loom child. He was a child that was not supposed to be. And his mother was punished for bringing him into the world. She was sent to exile, and the draft transcended her. The elders transcended her. An interesting little point, the elders are actually named after the three fates, which also works with the loom. He was raised by Mother Hetchel, and I'm sure there's some reference to there for Hetchel, I'm not sure. And on the eve of his birthday, in which he would technically become a man in the belief of the Weavers Guild, but he was forbidden to be taught the ways of the weavers. Now, of course, the loom, the pattern is failing, they discover. They blame Bobbin, but it's actually failing of its own accord, which means something's coming. And you learn some of the history if you pay attention to certain things. Some of the guilds have been around for a long time. Some of the guilds have, and the guilds are somewhat basic in some of it. You actually run across only a few guilds, and it touches on some mysticism and mystical beliefs. But you run into and all your actions will have consequences in the game, and everything needs to happen. But there are certain things one can do, to do the right thing. Now, of the guilds you meet after you leave Loom Island, you will eventually meet the Guild of Shepherds, the Guild of Glassmakers. You will see that there is some tension. Some people are suspicious of another guild, the Guild of Clerics. And apparently they are asking for something special from the glassmakers, a scrying sphere. So apparently the glassmakers have this ability to create a glass sphere that can see so much into the future. They are also very intellectual. They won't raise up against an oppressor even if it would be beneficial to them, because in their eyes it makes them as it brings them down to the oppressor's level. So they look towards enlightenment, clarity, hence glass. They don't necessarily smile upon other things. They appreciate clarity, clear thought. The shepherds have a request from the Guild of Clerics too. They're being asked for sheep. Enough sheep to feed an army. And even this worries the shepherds. Now the shepherds are very peaceful. They are willing to fight if they need to. And they have some techniques to them. They know how to cloak, which is a technique Bombin will use later. They aren't necessarily scared of much except certain things. Now they have a problem because their sheep are being snatched by a local dragon. Now, of course, you have to save the sheep by doing something your character will absolutely detest. But it's for the sheep's benefit. Now, after he saves the sheep, he gets carried off by the dragon. The dragon actually seems pretty decent. She's not about to eat a human. Unless. And she's a fire-breathing dragon who has a certain phobia. So, you have to figure out how to escape the dragon, then get out of the caves that you've been trapped in, or been dropped off in. And in the same process, you can find some more clues of what you're supposed to do, and when. Then you finally meet the Guild of the Forges, the blacksmiths, who are very, very secretive. They don't even allow anyone in unless it's a special circumstance, i.e., paying client. Well, you meet one guy, and of course you will learn what you need to do. Of course, during your way there. However, when you do that, it will in turn lead to this young man's death. So sad. Now, you are also then introduced to what you think might be your foe. And you have to do certain things because they're expected. The longer you put them off, there's no time limit on the game. You see, you find out that the head of the clerics wants to bring forth an army of dead soldiers to fight for him. He just needs everything he needs to do it. Unfortunately, he's more power driven than he is intellect driven. While he thinks his plan will work, and here's where another part of mysticism comes in, he figures you just open the veil to the other side, the world to the other side, at a cemetery where the pattern is weakest. And what he ends up doing is unleashing a great horror onto the world. This is the real tragedy that the Loom is foreseeing. That the pattern is failing because this is coming. However, Bobbin has been on this because he is trying to find out what has happened to all his, people in his guild, even though they didn't necessarily care the best for him. Most of them. The story ends with Bobbin doing, finding the swans, finding his mother, and then he must do what he can to stop this chaos. And sadly, there is only one solution. And I'm not going to tell you it. Because it's a game to experience. I have to give you that. It is a game to experience. You can watch it. You can learn everything you have to do by watching a playthrough, reading a walkthrough and everything. But it's also part of the experience. The sad thing is, it does leave you on a cliffhanger that the, quote, 2 sequel games would have closed the story. It would have made a good trilogy. The first sequel was to be known as Forge. And the second sequel was to be called, I believe, Fold. And they're terms that go with the other characters that you're introduced to. I mean, when you're given a name for a character, that means they're important to the story and important to a bigger story. Especially if you're given, if there's a lot of significance put on their character. Like the characters that Bobbin interacts with, the heads of the guilds, they're important. And if they don't die, there's a reason they're left alive. And the sad thing is, you never get to experience that. And because the sequels were never made. In fact, there is talk that someone is working on an, quote, unofficial version of the sequels. And somebody is working on Forge. And I think it would be great if they released it. And they eventually got around to doing the third game, Fold. Because, the story ends on such a cliffhanger. While it completes a story, it leaves you with other questions. But it's a beautiful game, and it was so big that they even created an audio drama that you could get a copy with certain copies of the game that gives you the more of the backstory about how Bobbin came into being. I think I have actually the recording. I've just never listened to it myself. And I don't know if that's because I've just been too busy or anything else. But it's something to listen to. And one of these days I will get down to listening to it. You can understand the story. I believe it will help you understand the story a bit more. And of course, this day with wikis and everything, you can look it up. However, Loom is a beautiful game. It's a game you should play, even if you've seen other people play it. Its music is beautiful. It is visually beautiful. There's some humor in it. You just have to watch for it. And literally, you have to think. You have to think outside the box sometimes. Some of the solutions aren't necessarily obvious, but they're not unobvious. They're not difficult to find the answers to. Anyhow, that's my retrospective on Myst. And again, it's a beautiful game. I recommend you play it. I do recommend you experience it. And if you have a love of Tchaikovsky, play the game. If you have a love of music, play the game. If you have a love of LucasArts products, find the game, buy the game. It's a great game to experience. And that's all I'm going to say on that. Take care all. This is Rich Kale here on YouTube, Rich Gen X elsewhere. Bye.